In the dead of night, two black men, Jamal and Troy, find themselves on a secluded stretch of highway in Texas. The road is silent, the sky an endless canvas of stars. Jamal, a 28-year-old mechanic, and Troy, his 31-year-old cousin who works as a local journalist, are returning from a protest they attended earlier that day, fighting for justice after another black man was wrongfully shot by the police. The hum of their engine is broken by the flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror. The vehicle behind them is unmarked, and as the men exchange wary glances, they know something isn't right. A brutal encounter with two officers, Detective Ethan Carter and Sergeant Jessica Miller, reveals the corrupt nature of their power. And before the men can process what's happening, the officers set a sinister trap that will unravel the truth behind a web of corruption stretching all the way to the top. The truck rumbled over the cracked pavement, its headlights cutting through the empty Texas night. Jamal's hands gripped the steering wheel tight, the fingers of his left hand twitching with a rhythm only he could feel. Troy sat next to him, his face half lit by the dashboard, eyes scanning the dark road ahead. "I hate this stretch," Jamal muttered, his voice low and tight with tension. "Something always feels off about it." Troy chuckled dryly, rubbing his eyes. "It's just the night playing tricks on you, man. We've driven it 100 times. But Jamal wasn't convinced. His instincts had been sharper ever since that protest earlier in the day. After seeing the body of another black man who had been shot by the police, his gut had been churning with a mix of anger and unease. The night had become a reflection of that rage, a constant reminder that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how hard his people fought, the system was still broken. Troy glanced at him, sensing the change in his cousin's mood. "You good?" he asked, his voice low, knowing Jamal didn't like to talk about it. "I'm fine. Just tired, man," Jamal replied, forcing a smile. But Troy could see the weariness in his eyes. They both were. The weight of the day had taken a toll on them both. But they had made a pact that they would not let the world's cruelty drag them down. They had to fight, however they could. Before Troy could respond, the sharp flash of red and blue lights reflected in the rearview mirror, and Jamal's breath hitched. "Shit," he muttered under his breath, slowing the truck and pulling over to the shoulder of the highway. The cruiser behind them wasn't a regular police vehicle. It was unmarked, plain, no badges, no identifying insignia. Jamal's heart rate picked up as he shifted the truck into park. A dangerous kind of fear clawed at him. Had been pulled over before, but something about tonight felt different. Troy noticed it too. "Just stay cool, Jamal," he said, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. He began recording the encounter, knowing they needed proof of any possible abuse, no matter how small. The door of the unmarked car creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, his broad shoulders barely fitting into the tight uniform. He had the face of a man who'd seen too many battles. A hard, weathered expression that suggested he wasn't interested in small talk. Detective Ethan Carter was the kind of cop who intimidated just by standing still. His jawline was sharp, his skin tanned from years under the brutal Texan sun, and his eyes were a cold, calculating blue. He was a seasoned officer, known for being relentless but not always in the right ways. He approached the driver's side window, his boots echoing against the pavement. "Evening," he said, his voice low and slow, with a drawl that felt like it could suffocate you. Jamal's grip tightened on the wheel, but he forced himself to relax. He looked up at Carter with a tight smile. "Evening, officer. What's the problem?" "Speeding," Carter replied, his eyes narrowing. "You know how fast you were going?" Jamal shook his head, trying to play it calm. "I don't think I was speeding, officer." Carter stared at him for a beat longer than was comfortable, his eyes studying Jamal with a dangerous intensity. Then, without a word, he tapped the side of the truck, signaling for his partner to approach. Sergeant Jessica Miller, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-30s, stepped up to the passenger side. She had a hardened demeanor, with a face that could have belonged to someone far older than her years. Her eyes didn't just observe, she analyzed, calculated. Everything about her seemed designed for intimidation. Troy straightened up, ready to assert himself, but he kept quiet. He knew better than to escalate things unnecessarily. Miller looked at him for a moment, then turned back to Jamal. License and registration, she said, her voice clipped, demanding. Jamal reached for his glove compartment slowly, trying to keep his movements calm. Troy felt the tension in the air, the stifling silence between them. He quickly shot a glance at his phone, still recording, but Carter caught it. "What's that?" Carter barked, pointing to the phone. Troy's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his voice steady. "Just recording the stop, officer. In case we need it later." Carter's lips curled into a smile, a cold, sinister smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You recording me, huh?" He leaned down, his face inches from Troy's. "You better be careful with that. Things might get real ugly for you real quick." Troy swallowed hard, his mind racing. Carter had already crossed the line, his threat hanging heavy in the air. Jamal looked at Troy, but the moment was interrupted by the sudden hum of an engine roaring past them on the highway. Both officers looked up, their attention momentarily diverted. The vehicle was a white SUV, sleek and expensive, with tinted windows. It slowed as it passed, almost as if it was checking them out before it sped off into the darkness. Jamal and Troy exchanged a quick glance. There was something about that SUV that felt wrong. It was too deliberate, too out of place for such a quiet stretch of road. "Everything all right, officer?" Jamal asked, his voice now more defiant. He needed to throw off the tension, but he wasn't about to let them off the hook for the way they were acting. Carter straightened up, his hand brushing the side of his belt. "You're free to go," he said gruffly. "Just watch the speed." Jamal didn't say another word as he cranked the engine and pulled away. But his thoughts were running wild. That SUV, the way it had slowed down as it passed them, it was deliberate, intentional. "I don't like this, man," Jamal muttered under his breath as he accelerated onto the highway again. Troy nodded, his fingers still clutching the phone. "We need to find out who's behind this." Unbeknownst to them, the game had already begun. The officers, Carter and Miller, weren't just pulling them over for a simple violation. This was part of something far bigger than either of them realized. And the truth would come for them, whether they were ready or not. As Jamal pushed the truck down the dark highway, the lights in the rearview mirror flickered once before disappearing into the night. The truck rumbled over the cracked pavement as Jamal and Troy pressed on, the weight of what had just happened sinking in with every mile. The encounter with Carter and Miller had felt off, and they both knew it wasn't just a routine traffic stop. Something was bigger, darker, and they were dangerously close to it. At Troy's apartment, they pored over the footage from the phone, the tension between them thick as they re-watched the interaction. Each frame told a story. Carter's sneer, Miller's cold eyes. But neither of them could make sense of the SUV that had passed by. "I'm telling you, man," Jamal said, pacing back and forth. "That SUV wasn't just passing by. It was checking us out. We need to figure out who's behind it." Troy pulled up local police records on his laptop. He had connections in the press, but this kind of research was new to him. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear that Carter and Miller weren't just corrupt cops. They were part of a much larger, more insidious operation. Jamal, with his street smarts, had always known that the system was broken. But now it felt personal. "They're not just dirty cops," Troy muttered. "They're linked to something huge." Hours passed as the two dug deeper. Jamal scrolled through records of stolen goods, illicit weapons trafficking, and missing persons cases that all led back to the same names: Carter, Miller, and, unexpectedly, Sheriff Bill Wright, the man who had once taken Troy under his wing. The walls in the room seemed to close in as Jamal and Troy realized the truth. They were up against a network that stretched into the heart of the local government. A group of powerful figures who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. "You don't think Wright's involved in this, do you?" Troy asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. Jamal paused, the blood draining from his face. "It wouldn't surprise me. He was always a little too close to Carter, you know? A little too comfortable with Miller." Troy sat back, running a hand through his hair. "That's some dangerous shit." Jamal stood up, his jaw clenched. "I don't care how dangerous it is. I'm not letting this go. Not after everything they've done." Suddenly, the phone rang, breaking the silence like a gunshot. Troy jumped, grabbing the receiver. "Troy," Vanessa's voice crackled through the line. "I've been hearing things. There's something big going down, and I think you and Jamal are smack in the middle of it." Her words sent a chill down their spines. They weren't alone in this anymore. Vanessa's voice was like a beacon in the dark. She had been a former convict, wronged by the system, and now, as a private investigator, she had a vast network of contacts in the criminal underworld. Her intelligence and street smarts made her an invaluable ally, but her past made her dangerous. She was a woman who had seen the worst and come out stronger for it. "I'm getting close to something," Vanessa said, her voice low. "I've been tracking the money trail. It leads straight to Bennett." Jamal's heart skipped a beat at the name. Richard Bennett was a local billionaire with ties to every corrupt official in the city. His empire had been built on exploitation of the working class, of the law, and of people like Jamal and Troy. Bennett was untouchable, a shadow in the highest echelons of power. "How the hell are we supposed to bring him down?" Troy asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Vanessa chuckled darkly. "By getting to the people who work for him. I've got someone on the inside, but I need you two to act fast. This isn't just about exposing cops. This is about taking down an entire system." Jamal felt the weight of her words. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting to bring down an empire built on lies and blood. With Vanessa's help, they began to infiltrate the network. They used every connection they had, Jamal's friends in the streets, Troy's sources in the press, and Vanessa's web of informants, to get closer to the truth. But the deeper they went, the more dangerous things became. Carter and Miller, realizing they were being watched, began to turn up the pressure. The threats escalated, and soon, it wasn't just Jamal and Troy's lives at stake. It was Vanessa's too. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. They learned that Bennett's syndicate was trafficking in illegal weapons, drugs, and stolen goods, but the extent of his reach was even more terrifying than they could have imagined. Bennett's empire stretched beyond Texas, all the way to international waters, protected by layers of corruption at every level of government. But even as they connected the dots, they realized that someone in their inner circle was leaking information to Bennett's people. Every time they made progress, something went wrong. It was as if someone was always one step ahead of them. Then the betrayal hit hard. Vanessa was taken. They didn't know who had grabbed her, but they knew it was Bennett's men. Jamal and Troy were desperate to find her, but they were being hunted, cornered by the same corrupt officers they had been investigating. Everything seemed to be falling apart as they made their final push to expose Bennett's empire. They were running out of time and out of options. It all came to a head in a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Jamal, Troy, and Vanessa, who had managed to escape, rendezvoused there, ready to make their final stand. They had gathered evidence, damning video footage, confidential documents, and enough intel to bring Bennett down. But getting it into the right hands wasn't going to be easy. Carter, now on the run after realizing he had been outplayed, showed up at the warehouse, his face a mixture of rage and desperation. "You think you could just take me down?" he spat. "You think you've won?" Miller followed close behind, gun in hand, her eyes cold with malice. "This isn't over. You're all dead." The air was thick with tension as they all faced off. The shootout that followed was brutal. Gunshots echoed in the night, and the warehouse became a battleground. Carter and Miller fought with everything they had, but Jamal, Troy, and Vanessa were fueled by something greater than fear. They were fighting for their lives and for the justice they had been denied for far too long. As the smoke cleared, Carter lay on the ground, wounded but alive. Miller had vanished into the night. Bennett, too, was nowhere to be found, but his empire was crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before his crimes were exposed. The final chapter was a violent, heart-pounding conclusion. The evidence they had gathered was released to the media, and Bennett's empire began to crumble. But the price had been high. Vanessa was badly injured in the firefight, and Jamal and Troy were left with scars that would never fade. In the end, Carter's redemption came when he turned on Bennett, exposing him to the authorities. But the truth was bittersweet. Jamal and Troy were left to pick up the pieces, knowing they had done what needed to be done, but with no illusions about the cost of justice. As the story ended, Jamal and Troy looked out over the city, knowing that the fight for justice was never truly over. The scars of their past would haunt them, but they had survived. And for now, that was enough. Months later, Jamal and Troy had rebuilt their lives. Jamal's mechanic shop was booming, and Troy had written a book exposing the corruption they had uncovered. But no matter how much they tried to move on, the shadows of their past followed them. They weren't the same men they had been before the fight, changed, hardened by the violence they had witnessed. But in the end, they had made a difference. They had fought the system and won, at least for now. The road ahead would never be easy. But as they drove off into the night, the echoes of the highway faded into the distance. They had survived, and that was all that mattered.